There is a document sitting in the collections of the Wisconsin State Historical Society that almost nobody has read twice. Published in the Society's proceedings in the 1870s and 80s, it wasn't a pamphlet, not a fringe publication passed around by enthusiasts or circulated in underground circles. It was an institutional record, written by trained observers, put out through a legitimate academic channel, and then filed away where most inconvenient things eventually end up. Cited occasionally, referenced in footnotes, never followed. One of the articles in that collection is titled simply Ancient Copper Mines of Lake Superior. The author is Jacob Houghton. The year is 1879. It sits alongside letters, surveys, ethnographic notes, and the accumulated memory of a region that was, in the 1870s, still figuring out what it was built on top of. What Houghton and the others who contributed to those proceedings were circling around, without ever quite landing on it directly, was a question that had already been bothering mining engineers for 30 years, a question that still hasn't been satisfactorily answered. What happened to the copper? To understand why that question matters, you have to understand what the Upper Peninsula of Michigan actually sits on top of. The Keweenaw Peninsula, Isle Royale, the shores of Lake Superior extending west into what is now Minnesota and north into Ontario. This region contains one of the most extraordinary mineral deposits in recorded history: native copper. Not copper ore that needs to be smelted, not copper locked inside rock that requires industrial chemistry to extract. Pure metallic copper, sitting in the ground, sometimes in nuggets, sometimes in veins, sometimes in masses that weigh thousands of pounds, pure enough to be worked the moment someone lifts it from the earth. Geologists have estimated the original deposit held somewhere between 1.5 and 2 billion pounds of accessible native copper. 1 billion years old, the product of ancient lava flows and the slow leaching of minerals through fractured basalt over geological time. The deposit is real, documented, and not seriously contested. When American mining companies moved into the region in the 1840s, after the Ojibwe ceded the Keweenaw Peninsula and Isle Royale through the Treaty of La Pointe in 1842, they brought surveyors, engineers, and the tools of industrial extraction. What they found when they arrived was not what they expected. The copper was already gone. Not entirely, but vast quantities of it, quantities that the engineers of the 1840s found genuinely difficult to account for, because everywhere they dug, they were looking at evidence of mining operations that had happened long before any European had set foot on the continent. Ancient pit mines, some of them 60 feet deep, tunnels, drainage systems built from wooden timbers that had collapsed and rotted long ago, stone hammers by the thousands, some weighing 40 pounds, with grooves carved into them to accept wooden handles, scaffolding made of split logs, the marks of fire on the stone walls of shafts and tunnels in a pattern that only made sense if you knew what fire setting was. Fire setting is a mining technique. You build a fire against the face of the rock, let it heat the stone until the thermal stress becomes critical, then pour cold water over the heated surface. The rock fractures along its existing seams, exposing the mineral vein beneath. It leaves a distinctive burn pattern, and it requires understanding the properties of rock under thermal stress in a way that doesn't emerge from experimentation over a single season. Miners used it in the copper mines of Sinai, the silver mines of ancient Greece, the gold mines of Egypt, and they used it extensively in the prehistoric mines of Lake Superior. The federal engineers who reported back in the 1840s and 1850s described what they found with a precision that left little room for ambiguity. The report published in 1850 by John Foster and Josiah Whitney on the geology of the Lake Superior Land District describes how one mining company uncovered a pit 26 feet deep, filled with clay and rotted wood, at the bottom of which sat a copper mass 10 feet long, 3 feet wide, and nearly 2 feet thick, weighing more than 6 tons. Ancient wedges had raised it, and it had been rolled along a wooden platform that since rotted into the sediment. Tool marks covered the copper itself, proof that someone had been working it before the pit was abandoned. That pit wasn't unique. The ancient mining workings extended across more than 100 miles of the Keweenaw Peninsula and beyond to Isle Royale, and everywhere the 1840s companies looked, they found evidence of operations that had come before them. The man who documented all of this most systematically was a soldier-turned-geologist named Charles Whittlesey. West Point educated, a veteran of the Black Hawk War, he'd practiced law for a time before joining the Ohio Geological Survey in 1837. Years of investigating ancient earthwork mounds in the Ohio Valley preceded the moment the federal government commissioned him in 1847 to survey the mineral lands of Lake Superior. Most of the next 4 years he spent in the field. What came out of that work, published by the Smithsonian Institution in 1863 under the title Ancient Mining on the Shores of Lake Superior, is a meticulous account of what he found. Whittlesey mapped the ancient mine sites, described the tools, documented the fire-setting evidence, and then he attempted to calculate from the volume of excavated material and the density of the ancient workings how much copper had been removed from the region in total. His estimate? Somewhere between 1 billion and 2 billion pounds. That number has been contested, adjusted, and debated ever since. The most frequently cited modern figure comes from Roy Dreer and others, published in 1961, placing the upper bound at 1.5 billion pounds. A University of Pittsburgh geologist named David Pompiani, working in the 2010s, took a different approach entirely. Rather than trying to count what was removed, he looked for chemical traces of the mining itself in the sediments of small inland lakes near the ancient mine sites. Lead that would have leached from mine tailings and vaporized during the annealing process, settling into lake sediments where it could be dated using radiocarbon methods. Pompiani found evidence of sustained copper mining activity beginning around 6,500 years before the present. The pollution signatures in the sediments correspond to the period of most intensive mining, suggesting operations at scale between roughly 4,000 and 5,000 years ago. A separate study, published in the journal Radiocarbon in 2021, examining 53 dated samples associated with copper artifacts and mine sites, placed the peak of the old copper complex somewhere between 6,500 and 1,500 years before the Common Era, with dates on embedded wood and cordage from copper artifacts reaching back as far as 9,500 years. The scale of what was taken from the ground isn't seriously in dispute. Where it went is. The academic designation for the people who did this work is the Old Copper Complex, sometimes called the Old Copper Culture. It's categorized as an archaic period Native American tradition, and the mainstream archaeological position, the one that appears in textbooks and museum exhibits, is that these people mined copper for local use, creating tools, weapons, and ceremonial objects, trading those objects across regional networks that, at their peak, extended from the Rocky Mountains to the Gulf Coast. That position is true as far as it goes. Genuine, documented, archaeologically verified evidence of old copper complex tools and ornaments exists at sites across the eastern half of North America. Knives, projectile points, owls, beads, bracelets, gorgets, pendants. Beautiful objects, significant objects, objects that tell a story of a sophisticated craft tradition and a far-reaching trade network. But the math has never worked. Take the most conservative estimate for total copper extraction, 500 million pounds, a number well below what most researchers accept, then account for all the copper in the entire known archaeological record of pre-Columbian North America, every museum collection, every excavated burial, every documented find, and you come up with a number that represents a tiny fraction of what was removed.
Even accounting for copper that's corroded, lost, or not yet found, the gap between what came out of the ground and what can be accounted for in the local record is enormous.
2 billion pounds doesn't become ceremonial beads and burial offerings. It doesn't disappear into trade networks that leave no warehouses, no hoards, no major accumulation sites anywhere in the known record. Something else happened to most of it. That's the problem that Wisconsin Historical Society proceedings were already circling in the 1870s, and it's the problem that brings us to what the Ojibwe remembered. The Ojibwe, also known as the Anishinaabe, are one of the largest indigenous nations in North America. Their territory historically spanned the Great Lakes region from the northern shores of Lake Huron west through Lake Superior into what is now Minnesota and into Ontario and Manitoba. The Wisconsin Historical Society records from the 1870s and 80s contain multiple layers of documentation related to their history, their oral traditions, and their relationship to the landscape of the Lake Superior region. Buried in that ethnographic documentation are accounts of what the Ojibwe knew before they came to it. The Ojibwe oral tradition isn't simple. Within the Council of Three Fires alliance with the Ottawa and Potawatomi, the Anishinaabe are designated as the keepers of tradition. Their memory-keeping institution, the Midewin, or Grand Medicine Society, maintained detailed scrolls, oral histories, maps, and records through generations of disciplined transmission. This wasn't casual storytelling. The Midewin's birch bark scrolls contain encoded knowledge that scholars are still working to fully decode. Within that tradition, there was a copper medallion, kept by one of the chiefs on Madeline Island in Lake Superior, stored in his sacred Mide bundle, and passed down from generation to generation. Each time it changed hands, a notch was carved into it to mark the passing of a generation. The medallion also bore inscriptions, and according to the recorded accounts, one of those inscriptions marked an event in the Ojibwe collective memory, the arrival of a light-skinned race. That detail appears in documentation compiled from Anishinaabe sources. It's not a creation story, not an account of supernatural events. It's the kind of record that a people who've been deliberately keeping records makes of a significant historical event. Across different branches of Ojibwe oral tradition, the light-skinned people are described with enough consistency that the core elements hold across multiple sources. Coming from the east, from across the Great Water, they came specifically for the copper, and they knew exactly where it was, which means they had either prior knowledge of the deposit or extraordinary ability to locate it. Working in organized groups, moving between sites, their logistics, according to the Ojibwe accounts, were purposeful and coordinated rather than opportunistic. Fire was central to their mining operations, matching the physical evidence in the mine walls exactly, and eventually, after an extended period of operations, they stopped coming. They loaded the copper onto vessels and left.
The Ojibwe accounts preserve no tradition of conflict with these visitors. The relationship seems to have been one of parallel occupation rather than confrontation, two peoples using the same landscape for entirely different purposes. When the copper people stopped coming, the Ojibwe were left with the land and with the memory. There's an important distinction to make here, one that's easy to blur, and that blurring has consequences. Who built the ancient copper mines at Lake Superior is not the same question as who lived on that land. Real is the right word for both the old copper complex and the Ojibwe and their Anishinaabe predecessors. Spanning thousands of years, the archaeological record of indigenous copper use in the Great Lakes region stands on its own. None of this is a competing claim. Indigenous peoples of the Great Lakes mined copper and made extraordinary things from it, and the Ojibwe themselves had a long relationship with copper as a sacred and practical material long before European contact. What the Ojibwe oral tradition describes is something different. Not their own copper working, which they were well aware of and had their own relationship to. They were describing visitors, organized, purposeful, maritime visitors who came specifically for the copper on a scale the Ojibwe themselves never replicated. The distinction matters because collapsing it obscures both sides of the history.
The Wisconsin Historical Society record contains documentation of earlier researchers noting this same discontinuity. Abandoned were the deepest and largest pit operations, the most systematic extraction sites. Ojibwe people who came after worked copper at smaller scales, using different techniques and for different purposes. A temporal and qualitative gap sits between the industrial-scale operations Whittlesey documented and the copper tradition of the historical Ojibwe. The oral tradition in describing visitors who came and left offers a direct explanation for that gap.
Whittlesey's Smithsonian report appears in 1863. The Wisconsin Historical Society proceedings with Houghton's Copper Mines article are published in 1879. Other documentation from the same collection addresses the early French explorer accounts. Jesuit missionaries writing in the 1630s were already reporting copper deposits described to them by local peoples, and Samuel de Champlain met Native Americans in 1610 who offered him a bar of copper they said came from the lake country to the west. European documentation of copper at Lake Superior begins almost from the first moment of contact. What Europeans didn't understand, and what the 1840s mining engineers discovered, was the scale of what had already been done there. The copper rush that followed the 1842 treaty cession brought American companies expecting to find an untouched mineral field. Instead, they found a field that had already been worked. The accessible surface and near-surface copper that should have been the easy first harvest was gone, taken, in quantities that could only represent a sustained, organized, multi-generational extraction operation. By the time the Wisconsin Historical Society was compiling its proceedings in the 1870s and 80s, that realization had been sitting in federal reports and geological surveys for more than 20 years. It hadn't produced consensus. What it had produced was a persistent, low-grade unease in the professional literature, a gap in the account that kept requiring explanation and never quite receiving one. The institutional response was to point to the old copper complex. Indigenous peoples mined this copper. Indigenous peoples traded it across regional networks. The copper is accounted for. But the volume problem kept returning. And in the spaces where institutional archaeology didn't go, other questions were being asked. For decades, European archaeologists and metallurgists have been sitting with a version of this same problem in peer-reviewed journals rather than popular history channels. The European Bronze Age runs from roughly 3,300 years before the Common Era to 1,200 years before the Common Era. Bronze is an alloy of copper and tin, and making it requires copper. The European Bronze Age required copper in quantities that the known deposits of Europe cannot fully account for. That statement needs some precision because it's easy to overstate and just as easy to dismiss. Europe has copper deposits. Britain has copper. Cyprus is so associated with the metal that the Latin word for it, cuprum, derives from the island's name. The Alps have copper, and so does Iberia. Archaeological isotopic studies have traced much of the Bronze Age copper used in Scandinavia to the Alps and Iberia, with some coming from Cyprus and the eastern Mediterranean. But the isotopic picture is complicated, inconsistent, and in some periods involves copper whose origin can't be neatly assigned to any known Old World deposit. The methodology of isotopic provenance analysis is genuinely contested among specialists. Different research groups have reached different conclusions about the same artifacts. The chemical fingerprint of copper is real, but reading it isn't simple.
What isn't contested is that the European Bronze Age consumed copper on a scale requiring organized long-distance supply networks. The Uluburun shipwreck, recovered from the seafloor off the coast of what is now Turkey and dated to around 1,300 years before the Common Era, carried more than 10 tons of copper ingots in the distinctive oxhide shape used for standardized Bronze Age trade. That's one ship. The Bronze Age copper trade wasn't small. Whether any of that copper came from North America has been raised by researchers across the methodological spectrum, and the mainstream answer has been no. No direct evidence of transatlantic Bronze Age contact has been definitively established. The alternative sources are real and well documented enough that the case for Lake Superior copper in European Bronze Age artifacts remains unproven. The case against it hasn't been closed either, and the problem that motivates the question, where the Lake Superior copper went, remains open. The Ojibwe description of the copper peoples, organized maritime visitors from the eastern water who extracted copper at scale and left by sea, describes exactly the kind of operation that would be required to move copper across the Atlantic in the quantities that disappeared from Lake Superior. That's a careful sentence. It says the description matches the requirement. It doesn't say the description proves the reality. What it does say is that two independent lines of evidence are pointing at the same gap. Enormous quantities of copper, the mines say, were removed and shipped somewhere, while the oral tradition says a seafaring people came from the east, took copper, and left by water. Solving the Bronze Age copper problem was never the point for the Ojibwe elders who preserved that tradition. They were describing what their collective memory had held about people they observed over what was clearly a very long period. The fire-setting detail is the strongest single convergence point. Ojibwe accounts describe the copper people using fire in their mining operations, and the physical evidence in the mine walls shows exactly the burn patterns and thermal fracture signatures that fire setting produces. The National Park Service documentation of the Keweenaw landscape explicitly notes that the ancient miners developed a process involving heating rock with fire, then pouring cold water over it to initiate cracking. The same technique appears in the copper mines of Sinai and the silver mines of ancient Greece. You can debate who carried it from one place to another, or whether it was independently developed in multiple locations, but the fact that it appears in both the physical record of the Lake Superior mines and the oral record of the people who watched those mines be worked is not nothing. The Ojibwe also describe the organization of the copper people's operations in terms that match the archaeological signature of the mine sites. Multiple groups working in coordination, movement between sites, and a logistics structure oriented toward transport of the extracted copper to the shoreline. The mine sites are distributed across a 100-mile corridor in a pattern suggesting systematic coverage of the deposit rather than opportunistic gathering. 60-foot pits dug in dozens of locations across 100 miles of forested lakefront over thousands of years don't happen by accident. They happened with a plan. Pompiani's lake sediment studies suggest the most intensive mining activity at Isle Royale peaked between roughly 6,500 and 5,000 years ago, with significant but decreasing activity continuing through roughly 3,000 years ago. A separate, smaller wave appears in the record around 3,000 to 1,500 years before the present. Then, the sediments quiet. Beginning around 3,300 years before the Common Era and ending around 1,200, the European Bronze Age overlaps the tail end of this picture, directly. The peak of Lake Superior copper extraction precedes and then overlaps the Bronze Age, and mining activity diminishes as the Bronze Age ends. Fitting timing doesn't prove causation, but it does mean the two phenomena were happening at the same time. There's a detail in the Anishinaabe documentation from the Wisconsin Historical Society records that researchers tend to move past without fully considering what it implies. The copper medallion on Madeline Island, passed down through generations with notches carved for each keeper, contained inscriptions recording significant events in Ojibwe collective memory. One of those inscriptions recorded the arrival of the light-skinned race. Not the arrival of Europeans, which happened in the 17th century and is separately documented in the oral tradition. The inscription marking the light-skinned visitors sits much further back in the generational accounting of the medallion's notches. The Midariwin was the custodian of this kind of historical record. Scrolls encoding events, histories, maps, and teachings were maintained across generations. When Ojibwe oral tradition speaks in its formal registers, it's drawing on carefully maintained institutional memory, not the casual recollections of individuals. For the Copper People accounts, that means they weren't passing references or folk tales. They were part of the maintained historical record of a people whose territory included the precise landscape where the copper operations happened. Guessing was not how the Ojibwe approached what occurred on their land before them. Instead, they were reporting what their tradition had preserved through disciplined transmission across however many generations separated them from the events themselves. Australian Aboriginal oral traditions have been shown to preserve accurate geographic information about coastlines submerged by rising sea levels more than 10,000 years ago. The fidelity of maintained oral traditions is routinely underestimated by cultures that default to writing as the only reliable form of record. Between the Midewewin, the notched copper medallions, and the birch bark scrolls with their encoded histories, the Ojibwe had three separate systems for keeping a record. Their record of the Copper People wasn't casual. The Wisconsin Historical Society proceedings from the 1870s also document the wider context in which all of this sits. The collections from that period include accounts of early French explorers who first wrote of Lake Superior, Jesuit mission journals from the 1600s, treaty documents, and the kind of layered, cross-referenced institutional memory that regional historical societies were built to maintain. Within that context, the Houghton article on ancient copper mines isn't an outlier. It's part of a pattern of documentation the society assembled across decades. Physical evidence from the mines, geological surveys, early European accounts of copper at the lake, and indigenous relationships to the land and its metals. Read together, those documents form a picture of a place that was intensively used by multiple peoples over very long periods of time for copper. What the institutional history failed to do, and this is a failure of institutional history rather than of the evidence itself, was to follow the accumulated weight of that picture toward the question it most clearly posed: where did the copper go? Evidence was collected, articles were published, and the Houghton piece and the other documentation were preserved through the decades that followed. And then the paradigm that governed American archaeology in the early 20th century settled into place, the one that said significant pre-Columbian transatlantic contact didn't happen, and the question stopped being asked. That paradigm wasn't wrong to be skeptical of exotic claims. The period from the 1880s through the 1920s was full of theories about ancient Phoenicians, lost tribes, Welsh princes, and Atlantean colonies that haven't held up to scrutiny. Skepticism was reasonable. What happens, though, is that reasonable skepticism toward bad claims sometimes becomes blanket skepticism toward the legitimate questions underneath them. 150 years on, the Wisconsin Historical Society's records are still sitting in the archive. The mines are still there, and the volume problem has not been solved. There's a passage in the Scientific American article on ancient mines at Lake Superior, published in 1848, that reads almost like a note addressed to a future researcher. The author asks simply, when did those ancient miners work these mines, and who were they? Trees of hundreds of years standing, the article notes, extend their roots on the surface of a soil which has required ages to accumulate over some of their deepest works. In 1848, the writer didn't have carbon dating. Wood from the ancient mine shafts couldn't be precisely dated. By the mid-20th century, it could. And what the carbon dates produced, consistently across multiple studies, were numbers placing the most intensive mining activity at 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 years before the present, earlier than the Aztec Empire, earlier than the Roman Empire, earlier than the Egyptian pyramids in their most famous form. That's when the copper was coming out of the ground, in enormous quantities, through systematic, organized, multi-generational operations, using sophisticated techniques that required prior knowledge and institutional memory to execute. The oral tradition says the people who did it were visitors. Coming from the east by water, specifically for the copper, they operated in organized groups with a logistics structure oriented toward transport. They used fire, and eventually they stopped coming. The archaeology confirms the operations were real, the sediment chemistry confirms they were at scale, and the volume calculations confirm most of the copper left the region. Eastward, by water, with the people who extracted it, is where the oral tradition says it went. What makes the Wisconsin Historical Society documentation particularly significant is when it was recorded. The 1870s and 80s predate the hardening of the no-contact paradigm in American archaeology. The researchers who compiled those proceedings weren't operating under institutional pressure to make everything fit a predetermined framework. They were collecting what they found. The Houghton article, the geological documentation, the ethnographic accounts of Ojibwe history and oral tradition, all of it was assembled by people who hadn't yet been told what conclusions the evidence was supposed to lead to. That matters for a specific reason. Evidence collected under paradigmatic pressure tends to be shaped by the framework the collector is working inside. Evidence collected before the framework hardens preserves things that later collection might round off or exclude. The Wisconsin Historical Society records from that period are pre-paradigm, in the specific sense that the paradigm which would later minimize their significance hadn't yet calcified into professional consensus. The Ojibwe accounts of the Copper people that appear in those records weren't collected by someone trying to prove a transatlantic contact theory. They were collected by someone trying to document what the Ojibwe knew. The accounts were preserved because they were there, not because they fit a particular interpretation. They've been sitting in the archives since then. They're still there. Whittlesey died in 1886. The Wisconsin Historical Society continued publishing its proceedings. American archaeology grew into a mature professional discipline with rigorous standards and frameworks that, among other things, established a strong prior against pre-Columbian transatlantic contact. Not as a conspiracy, but as the normal operation of a scientific field that had been burned too many times by wishful thinking dressed up in selective evidence. The copper volume problem got absorbed into that framework as an unsolved detail rather than a fundamental challenge. The mainstream explanation that the copper was used locally and traded regionally was sufficient to keep the question from becoming urgent. Mythology rather than historical testimony was how the Ojibwe oral tradition got treated, because the academic frameworks of the late 19th and early 20th centuries tended to treat indigenous oral traditions that way, not out of malice necessarily, but out of the intellectual assumptions of the period. Those assumptions have changed, substantially, in fact. Over the last 30 years, the methodological status of oral tradition in archaeology has shifted. The Australian coastline research, the work on Hawaiian genealogical records, the growing body of scholarship on the accuracy and longevity of maintained indigenous oral histories, all of it has pushed the field toward taking oral tradition seriously as a category of historical evidence, rather than dismissing it as folklore. Neither the Ojibwe accounts of the Copper people nor the Wisconsin Historical Society records have been revisited in light of those shifts. Steadily, the physical evidence from the mines, the sediment chemistry, the volume calculations, and the fire setting signatures have accumulated through the work of Pompiani and the Cambridge Radiocarbon Study Team and others, but all of it has been interpreted within the existing framework rather than allowed to reopen the questions that framework closed. You can still visit the mines today. The Keweenaw National Historical Park on Michigan's Upper Peninsula includes documentation of the ancient pit mines, and Isle Royale National Park preserves the Minong Ridge Mine Complex, one of the most extensive concentrations of ancient mine workings in the region. The National Park Service documentation explicitly acknowledges that the miners used fire-setting techniques, that they worked with stone hammers, some weighing 40 pounds, that their operations covered a 100-mile corridor, and that the scale of what they removed from the ground was significant. Museum collections hold the stone hammers. Dating has reached the wood from the shaft timbers. Analysis has covered the sediment chemistry, and documentation and preservation have covered the oral tradition. What hasn't happened is the synthesis, the bringing together of the physical evidence, the sediment chemistry, the volume calculations, the oral tradition, and the Bronze Age copper problem in Europe into a single coherent examination of what the combined picture actually suggests. One piece of that synthesis sits in the Wisconsin Historical Society archive from the 1870s, Another sits in the Smithsonian's copy of Whittlesey's 1863 report. A third sits in the Cambridge Core Journal's 2021 radiocarbon study, and a fourth in the National Park Service interpretive documentation. None of the institutional archives, though, can fully contain the piece held by the Anishinaabe oral tradition, documented across multiple collections and still held within Ojibwe communities. Individually, none of these pieces resolves the question. Together, they make a question that's harder to set aside than any single piece would suggest. The last element worth sitting with is the simplest. The Ojibwe Midewiwin tradition designated its keepers as the institutional memory of the Anishinaabe people. The copper medallion on Madeline Island was kept in a sacred bundle, passed down with notches carved to count the generations and inscribed with events the tradition considered worth remembering across those generations. One of those events was the arrival of visitors who came for the copper. That memory was carried forward through the period when the copper operations were ongoing. After the operations ended and the shores of Lake Superior went quiet, it was carried forward still. Through the centuries of Ojibwe expansion and consolidation in the Great Lakes region, through the disruptions of European contact in the 1600s, through the treaty sessions and the removal pressures of the 1800s, the memory held. It was still there in the 1870s when the Wisconsin Historical Society was compiling its proceedings, documented, published, filed. Researchers asking questions about Bronze Age copper supply in Europe don't, for the most part, know the Wisconsin Historical Society proceedings from the 1870s exist. Researchers studying the Ojibwe oral tradition don't, for the most part, read European archaeometallurgical literature on isotopic provenance. The volume calculations from the Lake Superior mine surveys aren't commonly read alongside the radiocarbon sediment studies, which aren't commonly read alongside the Anishinaabe accounts of the light-skinned visitors from the east. Nobody has put them in the same room and asked what they say together. The Wisconsin Historical Society published the document 150 years ago. It's been sitting in the archives since. Nobody followed up. The copper is still somewhere, the oral tradition is still there, and the mines are still in the ground. And the question the Ojibwe elders were already holding when Houghton wrote his article in 1879, the question of who worked their landscape before them and where the red metal went, is exactly as open as it was when they first asked it.